The year was 872, and the fjords of Norway thundered with war cries and wedding songs alike. In a coastal village carved into the cliffs, a girl named Solveig stood barefoot in the snow, her breath rising like smoke, her fate already sealed. She was to be wed to a man twice her age, a warrior with bloodied hands and a house built on silence. But Solveig was not like the other girls. She did not pray to be chosen. She prayed to vanish. What she did next would not only shatter her own life, it would awaken a wrath the North was never meant to remember. Solveig had never been afraid of winter. She was born into it, wrapped in wool, taught to listen to the wind the way others listened to their mothers. But now, winter felt different. It was not the cold that bit at her, but the weight of a name she never chose, Bride. At 15, she had already been promised to Halvard, a chieftain's cousin who had buried 2 wives and still drank like a god who hated himself. He smelled of seal fat and spoke like every word bored him, but his boat was large, his land untouched, and most importantly, he had silver. That was all her father needed. The deal was made before she bled, sealed with a nod, not a blessing. On the day they told her, Solveig did not cry. She walked down to the shoreline, where the sea hissed against the rocks, and she watched a gull peck at a dead fish until the bones cracked. That night, her mother braided her hair tighter than usual, muttering about duty, legacy, and obedience. But Solveig heard something else in her voice, regret, maybe, or a memory trying to crawl back up her throat. The braid hurt. It was meant to. She slept beside the fire, dreaming of ice melting into rivers and long paths through the pine forest. When she woke, her wedding dress was already laid out. White wool, blood-red thread. Her mother had embroidered a small knot along the collar meant to bring fertility. Solveig traced it with her finger, then pulled the fabric apart until it frayed. No one noticed. At the feast, Halvard drank first, laughing with the men as she sat beside him like a carved figurehead. He touched her wrist with thick fingers and whispered something about how quiet girls made the best wives. She did not answer. Her eyes found the door, the firewood stacked beside it, and the distant shadows of the forest just beyond the gate. She wondered how long it would take to run, how long before someone noticed she was gone. But she did not run that night. Not yet. She waited. She listened. She memorized the sound of footsteps, the layout of the hall, the tilt of the moon through the window. She knew her chance would come, and when it did, she would not be like the others. She would not be caught. Because Solveig was not trying to escape her wedding, she was trying to escape her erasure. The snow fell heavier on the second night. The longhouse was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the rhythmic snore of men who had drunk too deeply. Solveig lay beneath a thick hide, her eyes open, her breath shallow. Her wrists still stung where Halvard had gripped them too tightly. He hadn't spoken much after the ceremony. He hadn't needed to. His silence was not peace. It was control, the kind that watched and waited, the kind that tightened like rope around the neck. Solveig had not touched the food left for her. Hunger sharpened her thoughts. Every sound was measured. Every movement of the house committed to memory. She counted footsteps, door hinges, even the distance between her sleeping mat and the rear exit used to haul firewood. She had waited her entire life to be given a choice. Now she would take one. Just before dawn, when the sky was a bruised gray and the coals had turned to ash, Solveig rose. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might wake the others. She moved slowly, slipping past the sleeping forms of Halvard's kin, past the carved beams and the half-empty horn of mead. Her boots were hidden beneath a bench she left them. Weight meant noise. Instead, she wrapped her feet in linen and stepped into the snow barefoot, cold slicing through her with every step. Outside, the village slept under a blanket of frost. Only the ravens stirred, blinking at her from the rooftops. She didn't run. Not yet. Running left tracks. She walked calmly, as if she belonged in the dark. She passed the goat pen, the storage huts, and finally reached the tree line. Her breath caught. She had made it. Beyond the pines, there was no one. Just wind, forest, and the long path towards something else, anything else. She moved quickly now, weaving between trees, cutting through low branches, ignoring the bark that scratched her face. She had hidden dried meat beneath a fallen log 2 days before, just in case. She found it, wrapped in cloth, slightly damp but still edible. She bit down hard, chewing as she walked. She did not allow herself to look back. Solveig knew that every step forward was a step away from the girl they had tried to make her. By mid-morning, the sun broke through the clouds, pale and weak. She kept walking, stopping only once to drink from a frozen stream. She allowed herself a moment to imagine life beyond the fjord. Maybe in a fishing village, or aboard a trader's boat, disguised as a servant. She would cut her hair, change her name, vanish. But that evening, as the sky turned gold and the forest grew still, she heard it, the sound of hooves, too many to be wild, the low murmur of men speaking her name. They had noticed. They had followed. They caught her by the river. She had tried to cross where the ice looked thick, but her foot broke through, and the shock of freezing water slowed her. The men rowed in fast, 3 of them, all from Halvard's household. None spoke as they surrounded her. One dismounted and struck her hard across the face. Another pulled her to her knees by her braid. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She only looked at the trees beyond them, as if willing the forest to open and swallow her whole. But the forest did not move. The men tied her hands with rope stiff from cold and slung her across the back of a horse like a sack of meat. The ride home was slow, brutal. Her body ached with every jolt. Blood dried at her temple. Her linen-wrapped feet were cracked and raw, leaving a trail behind them the entire way. When they reached the village, no words were exchanged. She was dragged into the longhouse and dropped before Halvard like a gift returned by a disappointed buyer. He stared at her in silence, his jaw clenched, his fists resting on his knees. Then, without a word, he stood and left. The room remained quiet. No one met her eyes. Later that night, her mother came with a bowl of broth, but said nothing. Solveig did not eat. Her lips were split. Her mouth tasted like metal. She lay on the dirt floor, still in her wet clothes, and listened to the men speak softly around the fire, debating her punishment like she wasn't even there. In the morning, the thing was called. The free men gathered in a wide circle, standing over packed snow while the wind whipped their cloaks. Solveig was brought forward, her hands still bound. The chieftain's voice rang out above the wind, reciting the ancient laws. A woman who broke her marriage vow, who fled her husband's home, had broken not just a bond but the balance of the clan. One man suggested flogging. Another said she should be sent to the next fjord and sold as a thrall. Halvard only said one thing: she must remember. The vote was swift. Her punishment would be public, and it would be cold. That evening, she was stripped of her outer garments and forced to stand barefoot in the center of the village square. Snow bit at her skin. Her hair was cut to the scalp, not in anger but in ceremony. A rune was carved into a piece of driftwood and hung around her neck, the symbol for shame. The villagers watched in silence. Some turned away. Others stared too long. Solveig's eyes did not waver. She looked straight ahead. Beyond the faces. Beyond the flame. Beyond the fjord. Not with defiance, but with something worse. A kind of stillness. The kind that meant she had not been broken, only delayed. The ritual was called rebinding, though no rope was used. It was older than the sagas, older than the laws of the thing, passed down from the mouths of mothers who had once stood in the same snow. They said it restored the bond between a wife and her home, but it had nothing to do with healing. It was a ritual of breaking, dressed in silence and sacred fire. 3 days after her punishment, Solveig was taken from the longhouse before dawn. The village was still dark. Only the faintest orange glow peeked through the clouds. Women gathered outside in thick cloaks, their faces unreadable. Some of them had endured this same rite long ago. Others were still waiting for their turn. None of them spoke to her. She was led to the grove behind the hall, where the earth sloped toward the sea and the air always smelled of pine and smoke. There, a circle of stones had been laid generations before, blackened with soot and salt. In the center stood a fire pit, freshly lit, flames licking the morning air. Solveig's feet were bare. Her head, now shaved, was crowned with a thin wreath of dried nettles. She did not flinch when it touched her skin. 2 women stepped forward. One carried a bowl of black ash mixed with seawater. The other held a wooden rod etched with runes. Without ceremony, they smeared the ash across Solveig's chest, shoulders, and thighs. The mixture was meant to draw out disobedience, to cleanse the soul through fire and salt. When the bowl was empty, the woman with the rod approached. She pressed the tip to Solveig's forehead, marking her with the rune for need. Not freedom, not courage, need, as if to remind her that survival required submission. Then came the vow. Halvard stepped into the circle, hands behind his back, face blank as stone. Solveig was made to kneel before him, her knees sinking into wet earth. She was told to repeat the ancient words 9 times. I return to what I was given. I return to where I was bound. Her voice did not crack. She spoke each line as if reciting a recipe, her face as still as the frost-covered stones beneath her. When it was done, the wreath was burned in the fire, and the ashes scattered toward the sea. She was not returned to the main hall. Instead, a smaller room behind the hearth was cleared for her. No windows, no warmth beyond what slipped through the cracks. She ate alone. She slept alone. When she walked through the village, it was with her head down and her hands wrapped in red-dyed cloth, a symbol of her transgression. She was no longer Solveig. She was the reclaimed, but at night, when all was quiet, she traced the rune on her chest with a piece of bone, and though they thought her silence meant surrender, she was only waiting, watching, carving her next escape, not into the snow but into her memory. They thought she had been remade, that the ash, the salt, the silence, had carved out whatever defiance had once lived behind her eyes, but they mistook quiet for surrender. Solveig did not speak, not because she was broken, but because she was sharpening. Her days were filled with stillness, her nights with thought. She watched the way Halvard moved, when he left, when he returned, what he forgot. She memorized the sounds of the hall, the weak spot in the back wall where the timber warped from damp, and when the moon was thin and pale, she tried again. She stole dried meat from the storage hut, took a cloak left drying near the fire, slipped a small carving knife beneath her waistband. This time, she went north, where the trees thickened and the snow held fewer tracks. She traveled only at night, burying her footprints behind her with branches. On the 4th day, she reached the edge of another fjord and slept inside the hollow of a fallen tree. She was thinner now, faster. She had not cried once. Her hands still shook from hunger, but her mind was steady. She found work in a small fishing camp, pretending to be mute. They pitied her, gave her food, asked no questions. It lasted 11 days. Then one morning, a trader from her old village recognized her. Said nothing at first, just stared too long, too hard. That night, she ran again, but the camp was already stirring. She made it to the ridge before they caught her, this time with nets, like an animal. They did not tie her hands. They broke her right wrist instead, so she could not run far again. When they brought her back, the village did not gather. There was no ceremony, no runes, no ash. Only Halvard waiting at the hearth, his eyes dull, his mouth tight. It was no longer about law. It was personal now. She had embarrassed them again, had reminded every daughter, every wife, every watching girl that chains could be slipped if one dared enough times. So they invented a new ritual. One not written, one not spoken. They sealed her mouth with linen soaked in pine tar, bound her arms and legs in soaked leather that hardened as it dried. She was placed beneath the floorboards of the longhouse, near the foundation stones, in a small space once used for root storage. There was no light, no warmth, only the sound of boots above her and the creak of firewood. For weeks, she was left there, fed just enough to live. Water dripped from the ceiling, and rats gnawed at the corners of her dress. Still, she did not scream. She did not beg, and when the bindings were finally removed, her tongue was raw, but her eyes were clear. They had taken her voice, but in doing so, they made her story immortal. Because what survives is not always what speaks. Sometimes, it's what refuses. Centuries later, the sea had swallowed most of the old coastline. and the longhouses had rotted back into the soil. Only bones remained buried in ice and memory. In a dig outside what had once been Vestfold, a group of archaeologists uncovered something strange beneath the remnants of a hall. The earth was dark, packed tight with soot, as if the ground itself had burned. They thought they had found a cellar, maybe a food pit. But as they brushed away the dirt, a shape began to form, a human shape, twisted and small. It was a woman, curled on her side, facing north, as if still listening for the wind. Her jaw was fused shut. Inside her mouth were traces of pine tar and ash. Around her wrists were thin bands of hardened leather, still knotted, still unbroken. She had been buried without offerings, without carvings, without name. The archaeologists called her the Silent Wife. The villagers nearby called her something older, the Bound One. They said her story had been whispered for generations, though never the same way twice. Some said she had been a witch who defied her husband. Others said she had killed a man, but among the women who still lived by the fjord, her name was spoken only once a year, during the first snowfall. They said her silence was not defeat, it was protection, that she had bound her tongue not in fear, but in defiance, to keep her truth from being rewritten by the men who buried her. And perhaps that was true, because silence has its own kind of power. It lingers, invisible, beneath the words others speak. Solveig's story did not survive in song or saga, but in instinct, in the way women learned to move quietly through danger, to hide strength beneath gentleness, to speak through action instead of voice. Her rebellion lived not in history, but in inheritance. Every time a woman turned away from the fate laid before her, even in the smallest way, she echoed the ghost of Solveig. They never found a record of her husband. His grave, if it existed, had long since vanished into the mud. But Solveig remained, her bones locked in silence, her defiance preserved in the cold earth of the north. And maybe that is fitting, because she was never meant to be remembered for how she died, but for how she refused to live by someone else's command. The north has always worshipped strength, the strength to conquer, to endure, to kill. But the strongest ones were not the warriors who carried axes. They were the women who carried silence like a weapon and turned endurance into rebellion. If her story reached you, do not let it vanish again. Share it, speak it, because some voices were buried not by accident, but by design. And every time we tell their stories, we unearth them once more from the frozen ground of history into the living air of memory.